October 25th, 1946, 9:12 p.m. 125th Street, Harlem, New York. Albert Anastasia stepped out of a black Packard sedan and onto a block that did not belong to him. The air was cold. Not the kind that bites, but the kind that watches. Music spilled out of nearby bars, low and restless. Men leaned against storefronts, pretending not to look. Women paused mid-conversation. The street did not stop moving, but it noticed. Anastasia did not hesitate. He adjusted his coat and started walking east, his shoes hitting the pavement with deliberate calm. Behind him were two men from Murder, Inc., both silent, both armed, both aware that this was not Brooklyn, not Manhattan's West Side, not any place where Italian muscle set the rules by default. This was Harlem, and Harlem already had a ruler. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was not visible. He never needed to be. His territory announced him in other ways, and who stood too straight, and who crossed the street early, and who suddenly found reasons to be somewhere else. Albert Anastasia kept walking anyway. He had come to send a message. He had come to test a boundary. And before the night was over, Harlem would decide whether he was a visitor or a problem. Nothing about this walk was accidental. Nothing about what followed was negotiable. The man who owned death. Albert Anastasia was not a gangster in the ordinary sense. By 1946, he was the enforcement arm of the American Mafia, the man other bosses relied on when problems stopped being theoretical. As a founding figure of Murder, Inc., Anastasia controlled violence the way bankers controlled credit. When he entered a neighborhood, it was usually because someone else had already failed. Harlem understood this reputation even if they didn't use his name out loud. The question wasn't who he was. The question was why he was here. He did not dress like a street soldier. He did not move like a man looking for trouble. Albert Anastasia moved like trouble had already been scheduled. In 1946, the underworld in New York was reorganizing itself after years of wartime pressure. The old patterns had returned quickly. Money was moving again. Control was being redrawn quietly. Through unions, through docks, through construction contracts that looked clean on paper and bled underneath. The Italian families had their hands in most of it. But they did not always put their names on the doors they owned. They used men like Anastasia to make sure the ownership was understood. He had earned his place through consistency, not charisma, not speeches. He was known for getting to the point and staying there until someone stopped breathing or started cooperating. That was his entire function inside the mafia structure. When leaders wanted deniability, they used intermediaries. When they wanted certainty, they sent Anastasia. Harlem was a place where certainty had limits. The neighborhood was not naive about the Italian syndicate. Harlem's policy bankers and street captains had been dealing with outside pressure for years. Dutch Schultz had tried to take it. Others had tried after him. Some came with money. Some came with guns. What Harlem learned over and over was that outside power depended on outsiders being able to operate openly. It depended on moving without being watched. In Harlem, that condition did not exist. That was the first reason Anastasia's reputation mattered. It wasn't just that he was violent. Harlem had violence. It was that he was connected to the kind of violence that didn't stop at a block or a club. He represented a machine, a system that kept producing men, even after men were killed. That made him different. But reputation was only half the pressure. The other half was timing. Anastasia's presence in 1946 carried a specific implication. Someone inside the Italian structure had decided Harlem was back on the agenda. It meant the problem was no longer being left to negotiation, to polite sit-downs, or to low-level intimidation. It meant someone higher up wanted a direct assessment. And Anastasia, by habit, did not assess from a distance. He assessed in person. He arrived in Harlem with 2 men. Not because he needed protection, because bringing 2 men was a message in itself. It said this was official. It said he was not hiding. It said he expected the neighborhood to understand who he was without him needing to explain it. And Harlem did understand. Men on 125th Street recognized the posture before they recognized the face, the quiet confidence, the lack of scanning, the way his hands stayed relaxed, the way he did not slow down when strangers watched him. Those were not the habits of a visitor. Those were the habits of a man used to the world moving out of his way. Albert Anastasia walked as if sidewalks were owed to him. But what he stepped into was not an open sidewalk. It was an ecosystem. Harlem's underworld was built on visibility. Not surveillance in the modern sense, but awareness. Every corner had a purpose. Every shop had ears. The shoeshine stand, the newspaper vendor, the bartender washing glasses too slowly. None of them needed to carry a gun to be dangerous. They carried information, and in Harlem that was the first weapon used. That information always had one destination. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy was not standing on the street that night. He did not need to be. Harlem did not rely on constant displays of its leadership. It relied on readiness, on lines that were understood without being drawn. Bumpy was the man who enforced those lines, not by constant violence, but by the credibility that violence was always available when the line was crossed. Anastasia did not yet know where the line was. He was here to find it. He passed a bar where music leaked into the night, and the laughter inside dropped half a degree as he went by. He passed a corner where men were talking loudly until he got close, and then they suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. He saw movement in windows, a curtain shift, a face withdraw. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but enough to tell him he had been identified. That was when the dynamic became real. Because for the first time since he stepped out of the car, Anastasia was not dictating the atmosphere. He was reacting to it. And he did not like reacting. His decision to come to Harlem had been strategic, but strategy required accurate assumptions. The Italian syndicate's, as usual, assumption was that any neighborhood could be approached the same way. Test the perimeter, find the corruptible, find the fearful, then apply pressure until the structure bends. Anastasia had bent structures before. He had broken them when bending took too long. Harlem was different because Harlem was personal. You could not buy silence here without buying everyone. You could not intimidate one man without the block remembering it. And you could not make an example without the neighborhood deciding whether that example would live long enough to be repeated. Anastasia had come to determine what kind of power ruled this territory. He would learn quickly that Harlem did not answer to outside reputations. It answered to its own. Harlem was not neutral ground. Harlem in the mid-1940s was not an open market. It was a closed system, protected by relationships, fear, and memory. Bumpy Johnson did not rule Harlem by brute force alone. He ruled it by understanding who needed protection, who needed money, and who needed to be reminded of consequences. Numbers runners, bar owners, musicians, politicians, all of them existed inside a balance Bumpy maintained personally. Outsiders were tolerated only when invited. Anastasia had not been invited. That distinction mattered more than most men realized. Harlem had learned through experience that neutrality was a myth. Neighborhoods that pretended to be neutral became battlegrounds. Harlem survived by choosing sides early and enforcing those choices consistently. Every storefront, every club, every policy bank operated with the same unspoken understanding. Protection came from inside, not from whoever arrived with the most money or the loudest threats. Bumpy Johnson was the mechanism that made that understanding real. He did not sit in an office issuing orders all day. He moved. He listened. He showed up when people least expected him and stayed away when presence would create unnecessary noise. His authority did not come from constant visibility. It came from predictability. People knew what he would do if lines were crossed. That certainty kept most people from testing him. The numbers racket was the spine of Harlem's economy, and Bumpy knew every vertebra. He knew which runners were struggling, which were skimming, which were being pressured by outsiders. He knew which bar owners paid on time and which needed a reminder. He knew which politicians liked their envelopes discreet and which preferred favors that couldn't be traced. None of this was abstract. It was daily maintenance. That maintenance created loyalty, but it also created dependency. And dependency, when managed carefully, becomes power. When outsiders entered Harlem, they didn't just face Bumpy. They faced the accumulated memory of what happened to the last outsiders who tried the same thing. Stories traveled faster than gunfire. Men remembered who disappeared quietly and who left town suddenly richer but shaken. Harlem remembered lessons long after the bodies were buried. Albert Anastasia was walking into that memory. His reputation, formidable as it was, did not overwrite Harlem's own history. In fact, it activated it. Older men who had survived Dutch Schultz's war recognized the pattern immediately. Younger men who had only heard the stories felt the tension before they understood the reason. This was not excitement. It was preparation. Anastasia's presence threatened the balance, and balance was not negotiable. Harlem did not reject outsiders out of pride. It rejected them out of necessity. Allowing one outside power to establish itself invited another to challenge it. That cycle brought attention. Attention brought police. Police brought unpredictability. Bumpy's system minimized all three by keeping control local and disputes contained. That was why invitations mattered. When Bumpy allowed outsiders in, it was because he had already measured the cost. He knew what they wanted, what they could offer, and how far they could be trusted before their interests diverged. An uninvited presence skipped that process entirely. It forced a response before terms could be set. Anastasia's walk through Harlem forced that response. He did not threaten anyone directly. He did not ask questions. He did not announce intentions. But intention was not invisible. Men noticed where he slowed down, where he looked, where his attention lingered. Those details were reported upward within minutes, not through phones or notes, but through people who knew exactly where to go and what to say. By the time Anastasia reached the center of the neighborhood, Harlem had already decided he was a problem that needed definition. Bumpy Johnson received the information calmly. He did not issue immediate orders. He did not send men to confront Anastasia publicly. That would have been sloppy. Instead, he let the neighborhood continue doing what it already did best: close ranks without closing doors. Harlem did not stop Anastasia from walking. It let him walk just far enough. That restraint was deliberate. It allowed Anastasia to feel the limits without forcing a collision that would escalate into something larger. Bumpy understood that real power did not always announce itself through violence. Sometimes it announced itself through absence, through the quiet realization that nothing around you belongs to you. Anastasia was accustomed to environments that bent around him. Harlem did not bend. It adjusted, tightened, and waited. This was not defiance for its own sake. It was strategy born from survival. Harlem had learned that the first move against outside power did not have to be loud. It just had to be clear. And by the time Anastasia realized Harlem was not neutral ground, the ground itself had already shifted under his feet. Why Anastasia came anyway. Albert Anastasia did not make casual visits. His interest in Harlem was strategic: control of labor, control of money, control of what moved through the city without police interference. The Italian families had influence everywhere except one place that refused to stay quiet or compliant. Harlem represented unfinished business, and Anastasia believed unfinished business was weakness. He came not to negotiate first, but to observe what resistance looked like up close. In the Mafia's internal logic, unclaimed territory was an invitation, not an opportunity, but a liability. Every independent operation created uncertainty, and uncertainty threatened the larger structure. Harlem was the largest independent economic zone in New York's underworld. Its numbers racket moved millions. Its clubs generated steady cash. Its labor connections touched the docks, the rail yards, and the entertainment circuits. Leaving that much money outside Italian control was tolerable only if it stayed predictable. Harlem was no longer predictable. By 1946, reports coming back to the Italian families shared a common tone: not panic, frustration. Attempts to buy influence stalled. Attempts to intimidate stalled. Attempts to quietly place men inside Harlem's operations were discovered and neutralized without publicity. That kind of resistance suggested organization, not chaos. And organization demanded direct assessment. That was Anastasia's role. He did not come carrying offers, because offers required leverage. He came to determine whether leverage could be created. That meant seeing the structure for himself, understanding how information moved, measuring how quickly the neighborhood reacted to a foreign presence, determining whether fear or loyalty was the dominant currency. Anastasia had done this before in other cities. Most places folded quickly once they realized who was paying attention. Harlem had not folded. That alone justified the visit. Another factor weighed heavily: labor. The post-war period reopened battles over unions, particularly on the waterfronts and in transportation. Control of labor meant control of time. It meant deciding which goods moved when they moved and who got paid to look the other way. Harlem's proximity to the docks and its influence over black laborers made it strategically valuable. As long as Harlem remained outside Italian oversight, it represented a blind spot. Blind spots were dangerous. Anastasia did not trust reports alone. He trusted patterns he could observe with his own eyes. the way people reacted when they recognized him, the speed at which his presence traveled through the neighborhood, the quality of attention he received. Those details told him more than any meeting ever could. He also understood Bumpy Johnson's reputation well enough to know this was not a personal feud waiting to happen. Bumpy was not reckless. He did not respond to challenges emotionally. That made him more dangerous than men who relied on impulse. Anastasia wanted to know whether Bumpy's power was centralized or fragile, whether it depended on constant reinforcement or whether it could operate without him being visible. Harlem offered a rare chance to answer those questions in real time. There was also an internal message being sent by Anastasia's visit. The Italian families were watching. They wanted to know if Harlem could be pressured or if it required accommodation. Anastasia's presence was a probe, not a declaration of war. But probes, when resisted, often became something else. As he walked through the neighborhood, Anastasia paid attention to what did not happen. No one challenged him directly. No one tried to impress him. No one offered introductions. That absence was telling. It suggested discipline. It suggested that instructions had been issued and followed without hesitation. That was unusual. In most neighborhoods, someone always tried to make a deal early. Someone always thought they could be the exception. Harlem offered no exceptions. It treated Anastasia's presence as a problem to be managed collectively, not an opportunity to be exploited individually. That observation mattered. Anastasia's career had taught him that organizations built on individual ambition collapsed quickly under pressure. Organizations built on shared interest endured. Harlem's response hinted at the latter. It forced Anastasia to recalibrate what force would actually accomplish here. He had come expecting to measure resistance. He found coordination instead. That did not mean he was impressed. Anastasia was not impressed easily. But it did mean that any future move would carry higher costs than anticipated. Costs that would ripple beyond Harlem and into relationships the Italian families preferred to keep stable, standing in a place that refused to bend. Anastasia faced the central question of his visit, whether Harlem could be absorbed without destabilizing the broader system. By the time he reached the end of his walk, he had an answer forming, and it was not the answer he had expected. Bumpy Johnson did not rush. Bumpy Johnson learned about Anastasia's arrival before the car door fully closed. He was informed by a bartender on Lenox Avenue, then confirmed by a runner who recognized one of Anastasia's men from Brooklyn. Bumpy did not respond immediately. He finished his conversation. He paid a bill. He waited. Power to Bumpy was never about speed. It was about timing, and he intended to let Anastasia walk far enough to understand where he was. Bumpy had learned long ago that urgency was a luxury reserved for men without control. Rushed decisions created noise. Noise invited mistakes. Mistakes turned situations into conflicts that could have been avoided. Harlem had survived precisely because Bumpy refused to let outsiders dictate the tempo. He knew exactly who Albert Anastasia was. Everyone in the business did. Anastasia's reputation had crossed boroughs and decades, but reputation alone did not dictate response. Context did. And the context here was that Anastasia had come personally, without warning, into a neighborhood that functioned on advance notice and permission. That meant this was not a threat yet. It was a test. Bumpy understood tests. He had administered enough of them himself. Tests were designed to provoke a reaction, to force a man to reveal whether he was emotional, insecure, or reckless. Responding too quickly would tell Anastasia the wrong story. It would suggest fear or instability. Bumpy was careful never to suggest either. Instead, he let the neighborhood do what it already did naturally. Word moved in layers. The bartender's warning was the first layer. The runner's confirmation was the second. By the third layer, Bumpy's lieutenants were already adjusting positions, not by drawing weapons, but by relocating themselves where they could see and be seen. Corners filled, clubs quieted, cars idled longer than necessary. None of it dramatic, all of it intentional. Bumpy stayed where he was. He did not summon men. He did not send messengers demanding explanations. He allowed Anastasia to walk freely, because freedom in this case was a controlled environment. Every step Anastasia took was being observed, catalogued, and interpreted. Letting him walk was safer than stopping him abruptly. Stopping him would have forced a choice too early. Bumpy preferred to let choices ripen. As the reports came in, Bumpy asked only a few questions. Where was he heading? Who was with him? How were people reacting? The answers told him more than Anastasia ever could. The fact that Anastasia brought only 2 men confirmed this was reconnaissance, not an operation. The fact that he moved openly confirmed confidence. The fact that he did not stop to talk confirmed he was measuring, not negotiating. That aligned with Bumpy's expectations. Bumpy also considered what Anastasia could not see, the structure beneath Harlem's surface, the relationships that made sudden violence unnecessary, the way information flowed faster than bullets. Anastasia might own death in his world, but in Harlem, death was just one tool among many. It was not the first one used. Timing mattered because whoever moved first defined the narrative. If Bumpy confronted Anastasia publicly, it would escalate the encounter into a question of dominance that the Italian families would feel compelled to answer. That answer would not be clean. It would involve men who had nothing to do with the original decision. Bumpy avoided those outcomes whenever possible. Instead, he let Anastasia feel the weight of the neighborhood without being touched by it. There was also a personal dimension to Bumpy's restraint. He believed that men revealed themselves more clearly when they thought they were unopposed. Anastasia, walking without interference, would show exactly how he perceived Harlem, whether he slowed, whether he adjusted his route, whether he hesitated at certain corners. Those behaviors mattered. They revealed respect or the lack of it. As time passed, Bumpy finished his business and stood up, not abruptly, not ceremonially, just enough to signal that the waiting period was over. By then, Anastasia had walked far enough to understand he was being allowed to walk. That realization was the first message. Bumpy did not need to deliver it himself. The neighborhood delivered it for him, calmly, quietly, without confrontation. Anastasia had come expecting resistance to announce itself. Instead, he found restraint. And restraint, when applied deliberately, was more unsettling than any threat. By the time Bumpy was ready to move, the balance had already shifted. Anastasia was no longer observing unchallenged territory. He was walking through a system that had acknowledged him and decided how far he would be permitted to go. Bumpy Johnson had not rushed, because rushing would have given Anastasia control. By waiting, he ensured the control remained exactly where it belonged, the invisible audience. By the time Anastasia reached the center of 125th Street, the street had organized itself around him. Storefronts emptied, corners filled. Men who looked like civilians stood where lookouts usually stood. This was not coincidence. It was coordination without signals. Anastasia felt it. He had walked into hostile territory before. What unsettled him was the discipline. No shouting, no threats. Just space being created around him, like a circle drawn without chalk. Anastasia understood violence. He understood ambushes, traps, and sudden eruptions that turned crowded streets into killing grounds. What he did not often encounter was restraint executed at scale. Harlem was not trying to scare him, it was managing him. The invisible audience mattered because it removed anonymity. Anastasia was used to being watched, but not in this way. Here, observation did not come from shadows alone. It came from open faces that pretended not to see him, from men leaning casually who did not look casual at all, from women crossing the street at the wrong moment for no obvious reason. None of it could be traced back to a single command. That made it harder to disrupt. In most neighborhoods, surveillance relied on identifiable lookouts. Those men could be intimidated, bribed, or removed. Harlem's system had evolved past that vulnerability. Everyone participated. No one appeared responsible. That diffusion of responsibility made enforcement nearly impossible. Anastasia noticed that his own men had gone quiet, not because they were afraid, but because they were uncertain. Uncertainty was dangerous. It slowed reaction time. It created hesitation. Anastasia's authority depended on decisiveness, and decisiveness required clarity. Harlem was denying him clarity on purpose. As he moved forward, the space around him adjusted subtly. Pedestrians kept a careful distance, not too far to be obvious, not too close to invite confrontation. Cars passed slowly, their drivers glancing once and then looking away. Doors closed a second earlier than usual. Music dropped in volume as he passed, then returned once he moved on. These were not instincts, they were habits. Harlem had practiced this before. It had learned how to observe without provoking, how to pressure without touching. That practice came from surviving men who did not need to announce themselves before causing damage. Men like Anastasia. The invisible audience also served another function. It communicated limits. The circle around Anastasia was not tightening. It was holding. That distinction mattered. A tightening circle would have signaled imminent violence. A holding pattern suggested something else, containment. Containment was a statement. It meant Anastasia was being allowed to exist in this space under conditions he did not control. It meant the neighborhood had assessed him and decided not to escalate yet. That decision did not flatter him. It positioned him as a variable, not an authority. Anastasia tested the perimeter in small ways. He slowed his pace. The space adjusted. He glanced into a storefront window. The man inside met his eyes briefly, then returned to his work without panic. He stopped walking for a moment. The street did not react dramatically. It simply waited with him. That patience unsettled him more than open hostility ever could. In his experience, fear always revealed itself eventually. Someone would look away too quickly. Someone would flinch. Someone would break formation. Harlem did none of that. The absence of visible fear suggested confidence. confidence suggested backing. Backing suggested leadership that did not need to assert itself publicly. That leadership had a name even if it was not spoken. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was not present, but his presence was implied everywhere, in the way people behaved, in the way order maintained itself without instruction, in the way no one attempted to exploit Anastasia's arrival for personal gain. No one rushed to make introductions. No one whispered offers. No one tried to broker peace or profit. That silence was not indifference. It was loyalty. Anastasia understood loyalty in transactional terms. Loyalty was maintained through rewards and punishment. Harlem's loyalty appeared cultural. It had roots. It did not dissolve under pressure. That made it harder to buy and harder to break. As Anastasia continued walking, he realized something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer evaluating Harlem. Harlem was evaluating him. Every step was being logged. Every reaction weighed. Not to decide whether to kill him, but to decide what kind of man he was. That evaluation mattered because it would determine the next move. Not tonight, perhaps, but soon. The invisible audience was not waiting for instructions. It was waiting for confirmation. Confirmation of whether Anastasia respected the space he was in or intended to violate it. By the time he reached the far end of the block, Anastasia understood the truth of the situation. He was not alone. He was surrounded by people who had already decided they did not need to touch him to control him. The violence that didn't happen. Anastasia was used to fear changing rooms instantly. It didn't happen here. No one flinched. No one moved. No one reached. That silence told him more than gunfire ever could. If violence happened, it wouldn't end quickly. It wouldn't end cleanly. And it wouldn't end in his favor. For the first time in years, Anastasia recalculated in real time. He had seen the pattern hundreds of times. A shift in posture. A glance toward an exit. The subtle tightening of a jaw when men realized who was in the room with them. Violence didn't need to be announced. It announced itself through preparation. Here, there was none, and that absence was deliberate. Anastasia let the silence sit, testing it. In most places, stillness meant fear. Men froze because they didn't know what to do next. In this room, stillness meant something else. It meant discipline. Everyone knew exactly what to do. And what to do for now was nothing. He scanned hands again. No sudden movements. No nervous fidgeting. No one reached beneath a jacket or shifted a chair to clear space. The exits remained unguarded in the obvious sense, which meant they were guarded in every other sense. Violence here wouldn't explode outward. It would fold inward. Anastasia understood violence as escalation, a sharp act that collapsed resistance and forced alignment. But escalation only worked when the other side wasn't already prepared to absorb it. Harlem looked prepared, not eager, prepared. He imagined the first move, a signal, a blade, a gun pulled from somewhere close. The room would change, but not the way he was used to. It wouldn't scatter. It wouldn't panic. It would contract. The men who hadn't moved would move then, not toward exits, but toward purpose, toward containment. That was the problem. Anastasia's power thrived in chaos, in the confusion after something terrible happened, in the vacuum where leadership disappeared and fear rushed in to fill the space. Harlem offered no vacuum. Killing Bumpy Johnson wouldn't collapse the room. it would activate it. He thought about the men outside, the driver waiting in the car, the distance between here and the sidewalk. He thought about how long it would take for word to travel if something went wrong. Minutes, not hours. And once it traveled, it wouldn't stop at the block. It would spread north, east, west, through bars, clubs, churches, apartments, through people who didn't carry weapons but carried memory. Anastasia had made his name by ending problems decisively. But decisive violence required clarity. This situation offered none. Too many variables. Too many unseen lines of response. Too many men whose loyalty wasn't purchased, but earned. Bumpy Johnson remained still across from him, not watching Anastasia, but watching the room. That told Anastasia everything he needed to know. Bumpy wasn't worried about Anastasia's next move. He was confident enough to worry about everyone else's. The imbalance wasn't physical. Anastasia could still kill him. That fact hadn't changed. What had changed was the cost. Killing Bumpy here wouldn't look like strength. It would look like a foreign execution in a neighborhood that didn't recognize foreign authority. And foreign executions invited retribution. Anastasia had survived long enough to know when force solved problems and when it multiplied them. This would multiply them. Quietly at first, then publicly, then permanently. He imagined the commission hearing about it after the fact, dealing with consequences they hadn't authorized. He imagined explaining why Harlem had become unmanageable overnight. That explanation wouldn't land well. So he did something rare. He paused, not theatrically, not to show doubt, just long enough to let the equation settle. Violence was an option. It simply wasn't the right one. Not here. Not now. Not with witnesses who would interpret it their own way. The room remained still, but the meaning of that stillness had shifted. It was no longer waiting. It was resolved. The decision had been made without ceremony, without agreement, without blood. Anastasia adjusted his jacket once, a small, unconscious movement that signaled conclusion. He met Bumpy's eyes again and saw no triumph there, no relief, just confirmation. The violence that didn't happen mattered more than any violence that could have, because everyone in that room would remember it. They would remember that Albert Anastasia had come into Harlem ready to assert dominance and had chosen restraint instead. They would remember that Bumpy Johnson had not needed to threaten, posture, or raise his voice. They would remember who had controlled the moment. Two definitions of power collided. Anastasia represented institutional violence organized, industrial, impersonal. Bumpy Johnson represented territorial authority intimate, precise, and deeply local. One believed fear traveled outward. The other believed fear stayed home. Their conflict was never about ego. It was about which model survived contact with the other. Harlem was not choosing between men. It was choosing between systems. Albert Anastasia's power came from scale. It was built to function beyond neighborhoods, beyond faces, beyond memory. Men like Anastasia did not need to know who lived on a block or who owned a bar. They needed compliance. Their violence worked because it was repeatable, replaceable. If one man fell, another stepped in. That was the strength of the system. It did not rely on loyalty. It relied on inevitability. Bumpy Johnson's power could not be scaled that way. It was rooted in familiarity, in knowing which families had lived on a street for 30 years. in understanding which runners were desperate and which were ambitious, in remembering who had stood firm during earlier wars and who had broken. Bumpy's authority functioned because it was personal. It was reinforced daily through interaction, not periodic displays of force. These were not compatible models. Institutional violence depended on distance. The farther removed the decision-maker was from the act, the easier it became to repeat. Territorial authority depended on proximity. The closer the leader was to the consequences, the more carefully force was applied. One system absorbed loss. The other avoided it. Anastasia's world thrived on fear that radiated outward. A killing in one place was meant to echo elsewhere. It sent a signal to men who had never met the victim. That fear traveled faster than explanation. It simplified control. Harlem's fear did not travel. It stayed contained. It was specific. People feared consequences, not chaos. They feared what would happen if they crossed lines they understood clearly. That kind of fear did not spread easily, but it lasted longer. As Anastasia sat in the car, engine idling, he understood this distinction more clearly than he wanted to. Harlem was not impressed by his reputation, because reputation was external. It belonged to places that were not here. Harlem respected outcomes it had witnessed directly. Bumpy Johnson did not need to demonstrate power to Harlem. Harlem had already lived under it. That was why the silent message worked. It spoke the language of territorial authority. No spectacle. No witnesses forced to participate. Just a correction. Institutional violence would have demanded a response. Territorial authority expected acknowledgement. Anastasia had built a career on refusing to acknowledge limits. But here, limits were enforced without confrontation. That made them harder to break. If Anastasia pushed, he would not be confronting Bumpy alone. He would be confronting a system designed to absorb pressure quietly and return it selectively. The Italian syndicate's model assumed that control could always be centralized eventually. Harlem challenged that assumption. It suggested that certain spaces could remain autonomous if their internal cohesion was strong enough. That idea was dangerous. If Harlem could operate independently, others might try the same. That threat did not come from Bumpy Johnson personally. It came from the precedent his system represented. Anastasia understood that, and it complicated his decision-making. Eliminating Bumpy would not eliminate the model. It might strengthen it. Violence applied incorrectly here would backfire. Bumpy Johnson also understood this collision clearly. That was why he had chosen restraint. He knew that institutional violence required justification to continue. It needed escalation to maintain momentum. By refusing to escalate, Bumpy deprived Anastasia's system of fuel. This was not passive resistance. It was strategic denial. Harlem was demonstrating that it could control its environment without inviting outside enforcement. It was showing that power did not need to announce itself to be effective. That lesson did not flatter institutional violence. It undermined it. As the car began to move, Anastasia's thoughts were no longer about dominance. They were about containment, about how to keep this situation from expanding into something that would demand resources and attention better spent elsewhere. That shift mattered. Two definitions of power had collided, and one had revealed a vulnerability. Institutional violence was devastating when unleashed, but it was inefficient when opposed by cohesion rather than fear. Harlem had chosen its system long before Anastasia arrived, and for the first time in a long time, Albert Anastasia was forced to consider whether the system he represented could afford to challenge it. Why Anastasia walked away? Albert Anastasia left Harlem the same night he entered it, not chased, not threatened, simply escorted out by circumstances he could not control without starting a war he was not authorized to fight. The Italian families would later debate the meaning of that walk, but Harlem understood immediately. Bumpy Johnson had not needed to touch him, and that restraint, the decision not to escalate, changed how the Mafia treated Harlem for years to come. Anastasia did not leave in defeat. He left in calculation. By the time the car pulled away from 125th Street, the situation had resolved itself without resolution. No sit-down, no warning, no blood. And yet a line had been drawn with more clarity than any gunfight could have provided. Harlem had defined the terms of engagement without ever stating them. That was the problem. If Anastasia stayed, the next move would be his, and any move he made would force a response that could not be controlled locally. Violence here would not remain here. It would ripple outward into labor disputes, into political relationships, into agreements that had taken years to stabilize after the war. That kind of escalation required approval, consensus, cover. Anastasia had none of that. He was an enforcer, not a sovereign. His authority ended where strategic patience began. Harlem had placed him in a position where acting would be reckless and waiting would be interpreted as weakness. There was only one option that preserved both leverage and dignity: leave. As the car moved north, Anastasia replayed the evening without emotion. He did not feel embarrassed. He did not feel threatened. What he felt was irritation at being forced into restraint by a system he had not designed. Harlem had exposed a limit to institutional power without confronting it directly. That exposure mattered. The Italian families would ask questions. Why hadn't he pushed further? Why hadn't he tested Bumpy Johnson personally? Anastasia would answer truthfully, but selectively. He would explain that Harlem was cohesive, that any move would be costly, that the return on investment was uncertain. Those words carried weight because they came from a man not known for caution. Back in Harlem, the absence of spectacle became the spectacle. Word spread quickly, not that Anastasia had been chased out, but that he had been allowed to leave. That distinction was crucial. Allowance implied control. It implied that the neighborhood had decided the outcome before it unfolded. Men remembered that. Bumpy Johnson did not give speeches afterward. He did not call meetings. He did not celebrate. That restraint reinforced the message. Power that announces itself invites challenge. Power that operates quietly becomes assumed. For years after, Italian interests treated Harlem differently, not as conquered territory, not as contested ground, but as a space that required negotiation, not enforcement. When deals were made, they were made with Bumpy, not around him. When boundaries were discussed, Harlem's autonomy was acknowledged implicitly, even when it was not admitted openly. This did not mean Harlem was untouchable. It meant it was expensive to touch. That cost-benefit calculation defined underworld strategy more than pride ever did. Anastasia's walk made that calculation unavoidable. It established Harlem as a place where escalation came with unpredictable consequences. Bumpy Johnson's restraint did not signal weakness. It signaled confidence. He did not need to prove he could hurt Anastasia. Everyone involved already knew that violence would spiral. By refusing to initiate it, Bumpy positioned himself as the man controlling not just his territory, but the situation itself. That control was the real outcome of the night. Years later, men would argue over what Anastasia intended when he came to Harlem. Some would say he was testing Bumpy. Others would say he was laying groundwork. Those debates missed the point. Intent did not matter as much as outcome. The outcome was this: Anastasia left with information instead of influence. Harlem remained intact, and Bumpy Johnson's reputation shifted subtly from dangerous to untouchable, not because he killed someone, because he didn't have to. That distinction echoed far beyond 125th Street. It informed future decisions, future negotiations, future absences. Harlem had demonstrated that power did not always announce itself with force. Sometimes it announced itself by deciding when force was unnecessary. Albert Anastasia walked away because staying would have proven something he could not afford to prove, and Harlem never forgot that he chose to leave.